Okay, good morning, Kingsley School. I'm going to start our Remembrance Assembly now. So very warm welcome to you to this very special event within our school life. Remembrance Day is something that's very important to the United Kingdom. It's also known as Armistice Day. And we take this time because this marks the day that the First World War ended in 1918. On the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour, the war was declared ended. And we take that same time to have a 2-minute silence as a tribute to those who lost their lives fighting for their country. So this anniversary is used not just to remember those who died in the First World War, but also the Second World War and conflicts since, like the Gulf and the Falklands Wars, as well as more recent conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. The symbol of remembrance is the poppy, and that's been used since 1921 and was inspired by a poem about the poppies growing in the Flanders fields. And in the few weeks leading up to Remembrance Sunday, it's traditional in the UK to wear a poppy to support the Royal British Legion, which is a charity which supports soldiers and their families and war veterans. So this is our assembly for remembrance. And I want to talk this morning about one place and one time and one person. And my story is set here in a small village, just outside a small village in northern France. It's an area of France called the Somme. And this is a modern day photograph of a rural railway station. This was the site of one of the bloodiest battles of the First World War, which was fought starting on the 1st of July 1916. This station was significant because it was a place that was surrounded by tents in a casualty clearing station, basically a very, very basic hospital. And men were brought here from the front for emergency treatment, either to be patched up, shipped on, or died and buried. And the site is important because the railway line meant that transport was easier to get men in and out of this awful battle scene. If you turn your back on the station, then you see this view. Again, it's just a very rural French scene. But tucked in the bottom of the valley there is a cemetery, and that's a Wargraves Cemetery. And if you go into that cemetery, you see this. These little cemeteries are all over northern France, and they're cared for by the Commonwealth Wargraves Commission. And you can see that they are very, very well cared for. This is actually a very small cemetery, and you can tell it's a small cemetery because the cross in the far corner is on a small plinth. But this is a small cemetery, but 1,600 men were buried, and they all died in this small place. This is an unusual cemetery because the graves have 3 people in each one. And that's because this cemetery served this casualty clearing station, and so many more men died than were expected. So they had to put them in graves 3 at a time. And I want to tell you the story of one of these people buried in one of these graves. And this is the story of Frank Pryke. It's a very normal story. You can see he had no rank. He was a private, the lowest of the ranks of the British Army. And most families in the UK can tell a very similar story to the story I'm going to tell you about Frank Pryke. So this is Frank. He was called up, lived in North London, and after 6 weeks basic training was sent to France. Before he embarked for France, which was the only time in his life he ever went abroad, he had this photograph taken, and this is the only photograph he ever had taken, and I think he looks quite terrified. But this was taken as a studio portrait to be given to his family of him in his uniform about to go to war. He was in France on the 1st of July. He was in the area of the Somme on the 1st of July. And he and his mates, members of the 6th Battalion of the Essex Regiment, were well behind the front lines on the 1st of July. One of his mates kept a diary, and we know what was going on in their minds, and they knew where they were. They knew they were in the site of a big battle, and they could hear the shells, they could hear the rifle fire, they could hear the earth shaking, and they knew that there was a very big offensive going on and that they were likely to be involved. On the evening of the 2nd of July, so the day after the battle started, Frank's battalion were ordered up to the front lines. And in that afternoon and evening, they marched from the rear of the army into the front, into the trenches at the front line. As they did so, they passed the men coming back and the ambulances bringing the wounded and the dead back. And in this diary entry, one of Frank's soldier mates describes very clearly that they knew what they were going into, and they knew that this was going to be hugely dramatic. So the night of the 2nd of July, Frank and the Essex Regiment spent that night in the trenches on the front line. On the morning of the 3rd of July, Frank and his battalion were ordered over the top, basically on a ladder, out of the trenches, into the battlefield. And they were ordered to walk into the enemy fire. Not surprisingly, Frank was badly injured and was dragged off the battlefield, and after a short ambulance ride, was in that casualty clearing station at Healy Station, which I showed you earlier. On the 4th of July, he died of his wounds, and he was buried in the cemetery next to the makeshift hospital. News of his death was eventually communicated by telegram back to his family in London. And this is his family. There's mum, and there's dad, and there's a rather formidable looking maiden aunt. And then his 2 younger sisters are in the rear of the photograph. Now, why I'm telling you this story is because actually I find this quite shocking, because most families in the UK have a story very similar to tell to this. The scale of the death and the devastation of the First World War meant that every single family was affected. So this is just a very ordinary story, but it happens to be my story, because Frank's little sister, the girl at the back in the tie, was my grandmother. She never spoke about her brother, and I know the story that I've just told you because the Commonwealth Wargraves Commission have recorded every single life and every single death. And that's what today is about. It is about remembering those lives that were lost. There is a final episode to Frank's story. When I visited the grave at Healy Station and took the photographs that I've just shown you, I was on a school trip to the World War battlefields, a very standard school trip. And I knew we were near Frank's grave, so I thought I'd get a local taxi and I'd take myself and go and visit the grave, because I knew that none of our family had ever been there. Our coach driver volunteered to take me, so we had this rather peculiar situation of a 57-seater bus going through these little back lanes through country villages in France. But when we arrived at this graveyard, the driver gave me a military badge, and he said to me, "This is my son's badge from his cap. Would you please put his badge on your lad's grave? I lost my son in Afghanistan, and I'd like to know that in 100 years' time, somebody is paying their respects to my lad like you're paying your respects to yours." And that's what we're doing today. We are paying our respects to every man and woman who has died in conflict, whether it was 100 years ago or whether it was more recently. So we're now going to move into our act of remembrance. I'm going to read to you a poem, and then I'm going to play the last post, and then I'm going to have a moment's silence, and then we will play the Reveille. So I'm going to read this poem, and I'd like you to echo the last line, please. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. We will remember them. Thank you, everybody. That's the end of the assembly. Your teachers will now dismiss you into break. Thank you.